Thank you for joining us again on Gods, Demons, and Magic. This is your host, Sri Satchidananda Das. So today we'll continue our discussion of the Daemons and Daemons that we discussed before, going deeper into the topic of Egyptian astrology. So as mentioned before, the Egyptians, they categorized the night sky into 36 constellations, and the sun, moving sort of backwards through these constellations, then counted the time. And the entire year was divided into 36 sections of 10 days apiece, and the sun would move through one constellation every 10 days. And each of these constellations, you would see it rise on the eastern horizon. Gradually, after 10 days, a new constellation emerges from the effulgence of the sun, and you can see it before the sun rises. And so that's the beginning of that decan. And so each of these particular periods of time was considered under the control of a particular daemon. And in the beginning, as mentioned previously, generally they were controlled by daemons and gods and, sort of all these different heavenly influences. But as time went on, the decans became specifically identified with particular daemons. And so in the beginning, these daemons, they were depicted by the Egyptians as just like humans. And they had regular kind of human forms, which really means they were considered almost like gods themselves. But later on, they became depicted as animals, and especially as snakes, as messengers of the gods in the form of snakes. And as mentioned, daemon specifically means spirit, and decan means, in particular, it means servant. And so they're servants of the mighty ones. They're servants of the greater gods. And so each particular decan was considered infused with the qualities or power of the daemon it was associated with. And so, anything under the influence of time of that particular decan was considered under the influence of that daemon. And so using the decan, you'd identify the particular daemon that was influencing that particular moment of time. And through the symbolism of that daemon, everything it controls, then you would utilize it to do the various things, such as dealing with health, diagnosing and treating illnesses. Each daemon was in charge of a particular part of the body, a particular organ, or it was in charge of particular forms of disease. And therefore, by using a ritual that is specific to that particular daemon, then you could actually treat the disease. Or it could be a ritual, it could be using a particular mantra or prayer or magic word that is associated with that daemon, or going through a kind of sacrifice for that daemon, then that would be used to treat the disease. Oftentimes, one would create talismans, or the priest would create a talisman, which is essentially either placating or harnessing the power of that particular daemon. In later forms of magic, such as Renaissance magic, using books such as the Picatrix, European magicians would also create talismans in much the same way. Each particular planet, they wouldn't necessarily deal with a daemon, but the planets themselves, there would be certain times when their planetary influence is considered strong. We see this in the days of the week, right? Monday is the day of the moon. Tuesday is the day of Mars. Wednesday is the day of Venus. Like this, Thursday is the day of Jupiter. And even within then those days, that same planetary cycle is running. So you would utilize a certain astrological point in time when the particular planet's influence is at the strongest. And so at that time, then the magician, sort of harnessing the power of the planet, which is strong at that moment, would then utilize, say, a certain metal associated with that planet, say with the sun, for example, maybe gold. So you would actually use gold and carve your talisman at that magical moment. And while carving it, there's certain meditations and prayers that the magician is utilizing. He's basically performing a religious worship or a magical ritual while carving a particular symbol associated with that planet. And so, in essence, he's really trying to capture the power of that planet and beseech that planet to perform a particular duty, and then bring it into that talisman and empower it at that time. And this actually goes on to this day. Also in India, there's various astrological talismans. They'll use the yantra, or the geometric symbol associated with that particular planet, and they'll use certain numbers, like numerology of numbers associated with that planet. So this is a very ancient system of making talismans and trying to imbibe a particular object with the power of a planet. And all of this would be done in conjunction with the individual's personal astrological chart, their birth chart. So one could look at their birth chart and see what particular planet or planets are actually bringing about the disease or sort of karmically arranging that fate to take place. And then try to create a talisman to placate that particular planet. Or you could even, another technique is that one will see which planets are in a very good position in the chart and are actually protecting one from disease, and then create a talisman of that particular planet to sort of bring the power of that planet into the person's life and protect them from disease or get rid of the disease. So these are all different techniques that would be used by priests and astrologers and are even used to this day. Especially common, you'll see, is the use of gems, trying to get a particular gem of a certain size and quality and putting it against the skin to try to bring the power of the planet associated with that gem into oneself. And it's very interesting that you have in texts such as the Testament of Solomon, these Daemons and the Daemons associated with them, they become personified as demons, which are controlled by Solomon himself and utilized to build his temple. And so where in ancient Egypt, the priests might have had because again, they had to memorize all of this information. They might have had a table with the 36 Daemons and the Daemons, and then what are their various qualities, what are their characteristics, what do? Are they protector Daemons? Are they violent aggressor Daemons to be harnessed in the fight against one's enemies? Are they Daemons that have that are very kind and gentle and give knowledge, right? So all the Daemons have their particular qualities, and then also there may be like what body parts they're associated with, and then on another part of the table you would have what diseases do they cause and how to cure them, and then on a final portion of the table, the astrologer may memorize, how do you interact with them, how do you communicate with them, what names have power over them or do they respond to, what are their names, right, their various names, and what sort of rituals can one do to placate them or even control them. And in the Testament of Solomon, the way that this is, it's almost like it's transplanted from Egypt, is basically he uses the seal of Solomon or the seal of God, the power of God himself, to sort of summon the Daemons forth and then have them explain all that information to himself. And in the Testament of Solomon, of course, all the various gods and spirits and Daemons in the region around Israel, they're sort of demonized. They're all put into the same category as sort of wicked spirits or materialistic spirits. But nevertheless, the 36 Daemons are actually included in that list. And there they give, like for example, one of the Daemons comes forth and he says that he's the cause of sore throats and tonsillitis. And so the solution to this is to write a particular magical word onto ivy leaves and then sort of make a pile of these leaves together. And so if the individual with a sore throat does this, then his sore throat will go away. Of course, perhaps a more practiced Egyptian priest or astrologer would only do that if astronomically or astrologically the sore throat rose about during the influence of that particular Daemon or demon or 10-day period. But it's very interesting in the Testament of Solomon, you have the idea that using the seal of God or the name of God or the power of God, you can control these lesser entities. And it appears that in sort of these ancient traditions, the idea is that if you utilize the power of God to do this, to control these lower beings, then it has to be in the service of God. For example, Solomon wanted to build his temple. But if somehow or other you become deviated from that, and this is the temptation, you begin to try to control these deities and utilize them in your own service, then things start to become dangerous. And so there's sort of a fine line where religion and sort of religious magic becomes selfish magic. And it's really the line between left-hand path and right-hand path, or between white magic and black magic, is really the ritual is the same, but the intention is different. So the white magician would utilize his spiritual potency, and again his sort of consciousness of the divine, his raised consciousness through meditation and spiritual practice and association with the gods or with God, in order to call down or manifest the power of God, through his prayers and through his ritual, in order to control these entities, but utilize them for good purposes. And as we mentioned previously in a previous episode, snake charmers in India will do this to this day. They'll utilize certain particular mantras and things like that, certain meditations to gain power over a ghost, and then utilize that ghost for good purposes to sort of heal people, to drive the venom from a snake bite. So there's still these sort of practices today where people utilize these things for good, but at the same time it's very tempting. It can be utilized for one's selfish purposes. And you'll see, like within the tradition of magic, that in order to do that, there has to be some corruption of the ritual. Like, it's very interesting. You'll find in white magic, they would draw, say, for example, a pentagram, and it's a perfect pentagram, and it represents, it's this pure symbol utilized to sort of invoke the power of the divine and the good. But for these lower entities, in order to interact with them in a selfish way, there must be a perversion of the ritual. There must be a twisting or bending of the ritual, because the symbol itself is too pure, it's too clean to actually be utilized for something selfish. And so just as one's own consciousness is in essence twisting the very principle of utilizing this spiritual power, so in the same way the ritual itself has to be twisted in order for that twisted power to sort of work through it. So the pentagram will be misshapen, or it will be broken in one place. Or you'll see, the tradition of the Black Mass or something where, there's a religious ritual which is inherently pure, but you have to corrupt it in order to utilize it for corrupt means, or in order for negative forces to actually be communicated with or to work through that ritual. And we see that Solomon himself, in the Testament of Solomon, there's sort of a warning against doing this. Here he is, he's this powerful, wise king who has, by the power of grace of God and the seal of Solomon, he's gained control of all these demons, and yet he's tempted to use this power for his selfish purposes, to gratify his lust. From the ancient Egyptian priesthood perspective, he's coming under the control of the lower Daemons. And they're seducing him to utilize his divine power for lower purposes. And so we see that sort of towards the end of the Testament of Solomon, there's this idea where he sacrifices 5 locusts, or, he has 5 crickets or whatever, the locusts, these insects, and he sacrifices them in his hand to Remphan and Moloch, who are, considered demons from his perspective, or lower, at least, lower beings, and it's against his religious principles as a Jew, to have any interaction with them, and yet he sacrifices these insects to them. He wants to win the sexual favors of Shulamite, and Shulamite's described in the Song of Songs to be the first wife of Solomon, and it's a woman that he actually loved most. But in the Testament of Solomon, it's seen that he's sort of lusting over her, craving her, kind of like David and Bathsheba. And therefore he utilizes this magic ritual to satisfy Moloch. And because of that, he essentially loses the grace of God. Like, he's cast out. And he's also humiliated. And so there's a warning against the worshipping of demons there as well. It's kind of like, at the very end of the book where it talks about essentially using white magic. Then there's a warning about using it to gratify your lust. And that's always a temptation. So meanwhile, back in Egypt, Egyptian astrology was evolving and changing and becoming increasingly complex. An Egyptian astrologer named Tusar of Babylon, he may originally have come from Babylon, he began taking the various qualities associated with the Daemons, the qualities of the Daemons, and associating with individuals born under the influence of that Daemon. So again, traditionally, the Daemons were 10-day periods, and they're associated with the Daemon, and therefore the qualities and character of that Daemon was influencing that entire 10-day period. Now, if you look on the way you saw that particular Daemon, or which constellation you're currently under the influence of, is in the morning time, right before the sun rose, you looked at the eastern horizon. On the eastern horizon, you saw that particular constellation rising up. And as the sun went further and further through the zodiac, then, a new Daemon would become visible before the sun rises. And so, but what Tusser began doing is he began making this very individual. If you look at a particular person's personal astrological chart of their birth time, and then you look at whatever decan was on the eastern horizon at their birth, then he would say that that particular decan and the daemon associated with that decan was influencing that individual. So say, for example, you were born at a particular time when, like 12 o'clock in the afternoon, and it just so happened that the decan of Sirius was actually on the horizon. The star Sirius was on the eastern horizon at the time of your birth, regardless of where the sun is. Then you're going to be under the influence of that daemon and that decan for the rest of your life. It's a very important part of your personal character. The character of that daemon will actually be influencing you. And you'll see something very similar in modern astrology, where you have essentially the same thing, but instead of a decan or a daemon, you're dealing with a particular sign. Like, say, for example, you're born at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, and on the eastern horizon, Sagittarius was rising. And so therefore you're going to be considered a Sagittarius rising. And then whatever planets are in the Sagittarius at that time, Venus and the Moon, then that's going to be very influential in your chart. You're considered to have Venus and Moon in the first house, and the qualities of Sagittarius will be very, very influential in your life, your personality, especially your physical body, the way you look. You'll look like a Sagittarius. Generally, Sagittarius is considered to have sort of bigger ears, a bigger nose, and or wider hips, just like you look at the half horse, half man. So there's the particular qualities. Like, say, for example, Sagittarius is very much the point at which one is sort of trapped within the animal, yet striving for the divine. It's the struggle between sexual desire, sort of the horse, the more animalistic material desires of the body, and the desires of the archer who's pointing his bow towards the absolute truth, essentially. And so it's really sort of that dividing line where in one's spiritual evolution, one is struggling over one's lower desires and aligning oneself with spiritual desires. It's that spiritual struggle against the lower self. And so that's going to be a prominent theme in someone's life who has Sagittarius on the eastern horizon at the time of his birth. And then whatever planets and things like that are going to they're going to influence that. And then wherever Jupiter, because Jupiter is considered the lord of Sagittarius, whatever Jupiter is, that's going to also be a very important part of one's life. And so you'll see this tradition is also there within Egyptian astrology, but more dealing with the decans and the daemons that are influencing them. So you're going to look at a particular daemon, and instead of the qualities of Sagittarius and Jupiter, you're going to see the qualities of that particular decan. And it's very interesting that this same type of tradition of the qualities and the character and also the physical appearance of these decans, it actually translates, it's still alive today. In Vedic or Indian astrology, that tradition is still alive. It's very fascinating. There's an ancient Indian text called the Yavana Jataka, which means basically the astrological instructions of the Yavanas, which are the Greeks. So it's an ancient Indian text outlining Greek influence or Greek instructions. And this Yavana Jataka, it actually influences later texts, such as the Brihat Jataka Varahamira, which is about 500 to 600 AD, as well as another famous text known as the Saravali, which is in 700 AD. So this sort of Greek influence within Indian astrology became very prominent. And within the Yavana Jataka, it gives the decans or decans it comes into Sanskrit as the word drakana. And so the drakana, it's very much the same thing. Like you're dividing the night sky or the sky into 36 10-degree portions, and then you construct a chart out of that sky. It's called a drakana chart. And the Yavana Jataka, it preserves the qualities and the characteristics and the physical appearance of these decans. So it's very much this kind of ancient Egyptian tradition is actually there and alive in Indian astrology, and it was carried there from the Greeks. And So I'll just give an example of this. Like in the Yavana Jataka, it says this: the authorities say that every third of a sign is called a drakana in the language of the Greeks. So again, dakan. And so a third of a sign, because there's 12 signs and they're each 30 degrees. These are the zodiac signs. So you're going to take each of those 12 signs of 30 degrees, you're going to divide them in 3, and that'll give you your dakan, right? It's your 10-degree space of the sky. And so it says, I shall describe the 36 of them as they pertain to nativities because of their own qualities and those of their signs. So it's going to show what the qualities of these dakans are and how they influence a particular individual. And these dakans descriptions, they give us a kind of general feel of the individual's character. You know, what are the things they like? What are their propensities, their tendencies? How do they interact with others? And there's other descriptions, at least in the Yavana Jataka, associated with what are called the Hora chart, which is basically the same thing, but you're dividing the chart up a little bit differently. And it'll give like direct physical descriptions, you know, like their nose kind of looks like this, or they have breasts like this, or they give you a view more of their physical body, like what they look like. And the way that those are used, even to this day, is in what's called Prashna astrology, which is when you're asking a question and drawing a chart from that particular question. And so the way that it's used is that, say, for example, somebody has stolen something from you and you want to find out who they are. Somebody has broken into your house and stolen your wife's jewelry. You know, it's probably someone that lives on your street, one of your neighbors, perhaps. You're not sure who. So you go to the astrologer and you ask, and then he draws a chart from the time the question was asked. And then he's able to see, you know, yes, it was stolen. And here's a description of the person who has stolen it. And then he'll look in the chart of the dakans, and he'll show, okay, the individual has this personality quality. So they're born in the first drakana or dakan of Aries, so they're very combative, they're very quarreling, they like to fight, they're always very fiery, right? They hold a harsh discipline against those around them, and their life is constantly going up and down, right? And then maybe in the Hora chart, he also gets a physical description. You know, they have sort of luxurious black hair. They have very strong arms. Maybe they walk with a limp, or they're not, you know, their walking is a little bit strange. And from this description, the individual asking the question, well, oh yes, I know who that is, you know. That's like exactly describing my neighbor across the street, right? So in this way, you know, the astrologer is essentially providing a description of the person who stole the object. So that's how these qualities of the dakans are used to this day in Indian astrology. So in the next episode, we'll discuss Porphyry's question about how do I find my personal daemon, you know, which daemon is predominating in my chart and influencing my life. And so we're going to discuss that in more detail in the next episode, so please join us. So thank you very much for listening. If you found value in this, please like and subscribe. If you're listening on iTunes, please remember to visit srisachinandana.com/iTunes and leave a positive review. Thank you again, and we hope that you'll join us next time on Gods, Demons, and Magic.